All rise. Veuillez vous lever. Please be seated.
Yes, Mr. Haynes.
Now, the question I asked you just before the break was probably a little ahead of myself. I wonder if we could go in the document that is on the screen equal to page 6, please. And you've now got a hard copy of the document. And there are some further comments there. About halfway down the first paragraph, I can see the Serbian word prisutan. I wonder if you could read it.
I'm sorry to interrupt you like this, but during the break we were informed that Mr. Ostojic's client, that's Mr. Beara, wasn't feeling well, and I authorized his return to the detention center. I apologize to my colleagues for not informing them before we came into the courtroom.
Thank you. I hope it's nothing to do with Mr. Ostojic's return.
Yes.
General Pandurević, would you read the comments slowly for us that begin with the word prisutan? It's on page 6, and I know you now have a hard copy.
That's correct. Let me just find the word prisutan. Yes, I found it now. Something is present in inverted commas. Someone else will do that. I don't know if it's necessary to explain what this means.
Do you know what it means?
Well, it's a usual phrase used in the territory of Yugoslavia. One could say my concerns can be transferred to someone else. It means if I don't do it, someone else will. So it's just a matter of letting someone else carry out one's duties.
Thank you. And what was the main staff reporting? How did that phrase relate to the Zvornik Brigade at the time they assessed it?
Well, this has to do with the lack of motivation of soldiers and officers when it came to carrying out their tasks.
And I want to look briefly, please, at page 14 at the very bottom.
Yes, I found that.
And I wonder if you could just read us slowly the last paragraph of that page.
In the brigade, military subordination from detachments to brigade commands is not yet fully functional. Soldiers and officers have demonstrated a considerable amount of willfulness, and also the desire to lead on the basis of their own decisions. This creates a certain amount of confusion when it comes to organizing the daily life and work of the units, and when it comes to establishing relationships with third parties. Everyone addresses or turns to the brigade command for the slightest things.
Thank you. Now, given that we're talking obviously about March of 1993, the comments that were made about the Zvornik Brigade, were they comments that you would agree with?
Nakon izvršne
After the Zvornik Brigade had been controlled and visited in March, the team had a meeting with me and the brigade command, and they told us in rough terms about the assessment of the situation. And then this report followed. I was familiar with the situation at the time, and I agreed with the assessment. Perhaps with regard to page 17, I would add a general conclusion. It says, establish a tactical group consisting of 3 brigades and appoint a more experienced officer as commander of the tactical group. So the Zvornik Brigade was equivalent to 3 light infantry brigades.
Thank you. Now, during the course of our last break, you had the opportunity to go through a hard copy of the document. Did any brigade score a lower mark than the Zvornik Brigade in this main staff assessment?
ne nisu
No, apart from the Zvornik Brigade, the Bratunac Brigade was assessed, as well as the Birčani and Šekovići brigades. The Birčani and Šekovići Brigade was given a score 3.5, and the Bratunac Brigade,
da je 3
just a minute, I think it was 3.35. Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Before we move off that brigade, I do apologise for the fact it's untranslated, but I have to say in our defence it was submitted for translation 5 months ago, but as yet it hasn't come back translated. I'll let you know when it has. Now, General Pandurević, we've looked at, as it were, your position, the position of your officers, the general position in the brigade. Let's move on to your own personal perception of it. What were the problems with commanding and controlling the soldiers of the Zvornik Brigade?
svakako da je tu
There were quite a few problems. There's no doubt about that. Every brigade has a way in which it's organized and established. This is the idea one has about the brigade. It has to do with what is set forth in the rules, but its dynamic structure represents another element, and this has to do with how it functions in concrete situations. So when we tried to apply the idea as to how it should function in practice, we had problems. In order to establish control over all the units in the Zvornik Brigade, it was essential for me to have the aid of all my subordinate officers and of all my associates. I tried to find the best way of organizing the brigade, given the strength of the brigade. I tried to establish the best possible links between myself and subordinate units, but to verify the actual situation and to assess the actual situation, I would have had to be present in the field. I would have had to be present at the front line. I would have had to mingle with the soldiers, because this is the only way you can gain a real insight into the situation, and it's the best way.
How many of the battalion commanders were professional soldiers?
Komandanti bataljona su
The battalion commanders were usually foot soldiers with some more courage than others, or reserve officers. The commander of the 3rd Battalion, for example, in July 1995, was a professional officer, Branko Stoden, and the commander of the Mixed Artillery Division, Captain Miloš Maksimović. They were the only 2 professional officers. The others were either foot soldiers or reserve officers.
And what about the brigade generally? How many professional officers were there in the whole of the brigade?
taj broj se je menjao
The number changed in the course of the war. However, it was a very small percentage at all times. I believe that it was anything between 10 and 15% when it comes to the professional officers in the brigade, in comparison with the total figure of 270 officers that one professional brigade is supposed to have.
I'm sorry, did you say 10 and 15% or something else?
ne,
No, I said 10 to 15 men, officers.
Thank you. Where did the battalion soldiers come from?
vojnici u bataljonu
The battalion soldiers came from the villages and settlements where these battalions were deployed. At the very beginning of the war, the front lines were established in the vicinity of the settlements and villages. However, in the Zvornik Brigade, there was also one battalion composed of the soldiers whose families had fled from central Bosnia. And there are also several companies within the other battalions composed of the soldiers who had fled from some other territories of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
And how were they equipped?
pa s obzirom da sam
Since I joined from the Yugoslav People's Army, which had complete armament and equipment and all the necessary material and equipment for its soldiers, I was taken by surprise to see the situation as it was in Zvornik. The soldiers had uniforms which did not match. Nobody had a hat or a helmet. They had their personal weapons, but the soldiers were not autonomous. If you, for example, bear in mind the NATO soldier who carries over 30 kilos of equipment to be autonomous, our soldier did not have anything, was very much tied to his own home. He was not well equipped, and he was really badly disposed to carry out any combat tasks.
What percentage of the battalion soldiers were reservists?
Save for that one battalion commander who was a professional, all the others were reservists.
I wasn't merely asking about the commanders. I was asking about the as it were, the whole force. How many soldiers in the battalions were reservists?
All the foot soldiers in the Zbornik brigade were reservists. There were no conscripts, there were no professional soldiers as such. Maybe one or two who happened to be there. However, 99% of the force were reservists.
And how were the positions kept manned? Was it a system of rotation or what?
Throughout the war, there was a system in the Army Republika Srpska that was called rotation warring, which originated in the concept of a weakened warrior or weakened soldier. 50% of the soldiers were on positions and 50% were on furlough, on leave. This was necessary because the soldiers and their families would not have been able to survive otherwise if any other system was in place. Only in exceptional cases, when the territory was at a particular risk, there would be 70% of the soldiers on the front line, and only really very exceptionally the full force, 100%, were on the front lines.
And what authority did you have over those reserve soldiers who were not on duty?
In compliance with the law on the military, officers, commissioned officers, officer on contract, conscripts, and reserve soldiers on duty are taken as soldiers. In that sense, all those who were on duty were under my jurisdiction. Reserve soldiers who were on leave or were working from home or in their companies were not under my jurisdiction.
Well, since you mentioned that provision, we'll just have a look at it. Can we have a look at P703, please? Article 3, that's BCS page 187, and English page 1. Is Article 3 the provision you had in mind?
Da, imao sam ovaj.
Yes, this is the article that I had in mind.
Thank you. What was their attitude to fighting?
Pa znate kako?
Well, you know, nobody wants to fight. In a fight, you can lose your life. These people appeared to be very emotional because they were defending their families, their homes, and themselves. They still were forced to be engaged. They did not do it really willingly. They had to fight, but not willingly.
You mentioned earlier that it was necessary for you to be with them in the battalions on the front line. Was that possible for you to do that?
The basic principle, or rather the basic relationship in the army, is the command relationship. At the level of the brigade, these relationships are not personal, which means that the brigade commander communicates with his subordinates via written orders, which means I would issue written orders to the battalion commanders and they would then implement such orders. However, when my written order arrived in the battalion command, it was implemented to the extent to which it was acceptable to those to which it referred. The battalion commanders would report back to me that they did whatever they could, and in order for such an order to be implemented fully, it was necessary for me to appear on the spot in person, and this is what I very often did.
Thank you. Did you ever suffer any particular instances of rebellion or mutiny?
Bilo je raznovrsnih situacija.
There were all sorts of situations. Before the war, the Army Republika Srpska did not exist. There was no mobilization plan. Nobody knew if they would be mobilized into military units or if they would have work obligation. And then the soldiers believed that those who were not in the army did not have a justified reason not to be in the army. And they would often discuss if John was with them, why Peter wasn't with them as well. So in order to have my orders carried out, I would often conflict with my subordinates, although this should not have happened. The commander should never conflict with his subordinates, but it did happen on several occasions.
Did you ever find yourself in danger?
Pa jesam.
Well, yes. Although I did not consider that as a danger that would put my life at risk. At least I did not show it. On one occasion, sometime in mid-January 1993, I hit a barricade on the road when entering a village. There was a tractor on the road with a machine gun mounted on it. They prevented me from getting into the village because I had demanded for the men from that village to go to the positions. After a lot of discussion, they dispersed, but they still did not go to the positions. There was a similar situation in 1994 as well, when a company from the village of Skocic, not wanting to alter their defense sector, encircled me, demanding for me to grant them the approval to stay put in the place where they were. I had to give in momentarily, but later on I moved that company gradually. There were cases when whole battalions had to be moved from one defense sector to a different defense sector. It was a painstaking job, and I often had to negotiate for hours with the soldiers of those battalions. However, due to my good negotiation skills, I would succeed. I would not employ my military skills. I would rather employ my people management and psychological skills in order to do such things.
Thank you. There's just one little discrete area I want to deal with. Can we have a look at 7D1046, please? And forgive me, it's page 3 in the English, pages 2 and 3 in the Serbian text. What power or authority did you have to mobilize men to fight?
I did not have any powers to mobilize people or to engage material and equipment for fight. There was a law in place, the law on defense, which regulated those matters.
If you did need men, what procedure did you have to adopt through your staff?
I was duty-bound to contact organs for organization, mobilization, and personnel affairs within the staff, and send my request to the Corps Command. And they, in their turn, would contact the Ministry of Defense, asking them to mobilize men or requisition material or technical equipment.
Moving away from that, can we please have P2509 placed into e-court? General Pandurević, are you familiar with this document which describes the Zvornik Brigade area of responsibility for combat operations?
To be very honest, when I was in Zvornik, I did not see this document in this form. I only saw it here. However, I still had to comply with the provisions contained in this document because they were already in effect when I arrived in Zvornik, and I know what the document is about.
Well, I don't want to take too long with this because I took rather a long time with another witness a long time ago doing this, but I want to see if we can graphically appreciate what this document means. And behind you there's a map. I think you've been provided with a light pen. 7D1056 is the synopsis sheet for the map. And the title of the map in English is Zone of Responsibility of the Zvornik Light Infantry Brigade, according to the Drina Corps Command Order of 1992. I wonder if you could, first of all, show us on the map with the light pen where, as it were, what is described in paragraph 1A of that order is drawn on this map.
Ja bih zamolio časni
I would kindly ask the trial chamber to allow me to say something before I proceed, if I may. I would like to go from the more general things to the more specialized things. In the theory of the war doctrine, which I learned in the School of National Defense, there is a term, theater of war, and this is the entire territory of the state which is engaged in war. And this theater of war is divided into small rooms, as it were, which are called front lines. And below the front lines for the tactic group level units, we have zones, the army of Republika Srpska was responsible for the theater of war, which was the entire territory of Republika Srpska. The corps, as operative levels, were responsible for the parts of the territory of Republika Srpska which would be called front lines. And within the corps, every brigade had its part of the area of responsibility of the corps, and they were called zones. So the Zvornik brigade was also given its zone of responsibility for combat operations. This would be its full name, its full identifier, as it were. What does it mean? In practice, this means that the unit which is in charge of a certain area or zone of responsibility for combat operations, since its purpose is to be engaged in combat operations, this unit is responsible for engaging with all the enemy units that appear in that zone or which are in that zone already. And now I'm going to proceed and show you the borders of the zone of responsibility for combat operations of the Zvornik Brigade. We can see this red line, thick line, which I'm showing with not very well visible pen. These are the borders of the zone of responsibility for combat operations of the Zvornik Brigade. As one can see, this zone of responsibility extends far beyond the front line of the enemy's side. And it is not only the territory which is under the control of the VRS, but also a territory which is outside that zone. Hence, the Zvornik Brigade was duty-bound in case of any enemy forces appearing in this zone to engage in combat with them. Since the Zvornik Brigade was intended for combat operations rather than for training, transport, or commercial purposes, it was only responsible for combat operations and nothing else in that zone of combat operations. I apologize for my lengthy answer.
No, don't apologise. The area to the west of the front line, but within the dotted red and yellow line, was that ever within, as it were, the control of the Zvornik Brigade during the period of your command?
Da.
Yes, and what I'm showing now, this was all my zone of responsibility for combat operations.
But did you ever occupy any of that territory, the brigade? Did it ever occupy any of that land to the west of the front line?
The northwest part of the zone of defense of the Zvornik Brigade never suffered any changes from its very establishment in June 1992. Those were the defense lines along the Serbian settlements for the most part. There were some minor corrections of movements extending for 100 meters. In the southern part, there were some changes to the front line, and the positions of the Zvornik Brigade were indeed moved. Within this zone of responsibility for combat operations, the Zvornik Brigade had its zone of defense, where the soldiers of the Zvornik Brigade were deployed.
Thank you. The positions of the battalions are marked on the map. Probably we will need you to indicate where they are very briefly. Where was the command post of the 1st Battalion?
Ja sam rekao
I just said that the numbers of the battalions dating back to 1992 and 1993 differ to the numbers that they had in July 1995. The 1st Battalion was in this territory here that was between Malešeči and Vitinice. And we know that in 1995
with my naked eye, I could see the witness pointing to a particular location on the map, but the transmission, the video transmission, was not focusing on that location at the time. If you could kindly point again to the same place, Mr. Pandurević, please, and the technical troop, please focus on where he is pointing. Thank you. If we have the same map or parts, relevant parts of it in e-court that he can mark on, then it would perhaps be better.
Mr. Pandurević has actually drawn my attention to something that's rather more significant, which is that this map shows the positions of the battalions in 1992, and frankly, I don't think that's going to be of much interest to you. So I'm going to move away from this map, and perhaps we'll deal with the positions of the battalions in 1995.
Okay, thank you.
Now, we've dealt with the, as it were, general forces of the Zvornik Brigade. I want to move on to one specific battalion, which is the Manoeuvres Battalion. Did the Manoeuvres Battalion exist as such in December of 1992 when you arrived at the brigade?
no, it did not.
Was there anything like it there when you got there?
There was a unit of some 30 men, approximately, which was known as the Scouting and Reconnoitering Detachment.
I want to have a look very quickly at two documents, 7D1089, please. I'm told that the English version of this document is unfortunately not in e-court. We'll see if we can correct that overnight. And you'll need to look at paragraph 4, General Pandurević. This is a main staff order of the 20th of September of 1993. And paragraph 4 reads, the motorised battalion of the Zvornik Light Infantry Brigade shall remain in the organisation establishment of this unit, but continue to break it as a manoeuvre unit of the Drina Corps Command under the direct command of the Drina Corps. Battalion must be manned at 100% of the personnel and material establishment and shall be considered a completed battalion that may be strengthened with platoons or companies from the armoured mechanised unit. What did that order effectively create?
Dozvolite da vas
Allow me to correct you. This is an order from the command of the Drina Corps. It's based on an order from the main staff.
Svrha ovoga
The purpose of this order is to raise the level of combat readiness within the Drina Corps. And this was to be done by forming maneuver units that would be capable of engaging in combat outside of their territory, in the place where they had been established, since the Zvornik Brigade was fairly strong, and since initially it had this sabotage and reconnaissance detachment manned by young soldiers, the Corps Command decided that that unit, or rather the strength of the unit, should be increased. It should be formed as a battalion, which would be part of the Zvornik Brigade, and it would be under the immediate command, or rather direct command, of the Corps. This sounds a little contradictory. It was part of the Zvornik Brigade when it was necessary to provide it with food, clothing and footwear, but when it was necessary to engage in combat, it did so on the basis of orders from the Corps. When it came to combat, I could only use it in the zone of responsibility of my brigade. Outside that defense zone of responsibility, I didn't have the right to use them for such purposes.
And were you allowed to use them of right, or did you have to seek permission to use them?
kao što rekoh,
As I have said, in my brigade's own responsibility, especially when urgent action was required, I could act on my own initiative. But if I were to send it outside the zone of responsibility of the Zvornik Brigade, it was necessary to have an order issued from the Drina Corps.
I just want to look at a couple of examples of how that worked. Can we look at 7D705, please? This is a Drina Corps order of the 29th of May of 1995, signed by General Zivanović. Which indicates that he will command the forces from the forward command post. What can we see happening by this order?
ovo naređenje predstavlja
This order is a tactical example of what I was referring to a minute ago. The Drina Corps Command has issued an order stating that some of the Podrinje detachment forces, it was in fact a maneuvers battalion, but these forces were to be used in this combat situation, and they were to be under the personal command of the Corps commander.
And can we now look at 7D766? The document in BCS looks like a telegram. Is that what it is?
Da, ovaj
Yes, this document followed on the other document, the order we saw a minute ago. This is a telegram that the commander of the Podrinje detachment, Milan Jolović, sent to the corps command, or rather, to the Pribičevac tactical group. He has requested, for certain reasons, that one of his soldiers should be returned to Zvornik. He didn't ask for the soldier to be returned through the command of the Zvornik brigade. He asked this to be done through the corps command.
Thank you. Well, we can leave that alone then. Now, we're moving on to a very large topic, but we've got 10 minutes left, so we'll begin it today. There's been an enormous amount of discussion in this case about the JNA brigade rules. Can I take it you are very familiar with them?
postoji zaista
There really are very many rules that regulated the way that the JNA was to function. I'm familiar with most of them, but I wouldn't want to claim that I'm familiar with all of them.
Well, it was probably either my fault or a translation difficulty. I'm really only concerned at this stage with the brigade rules of 1984. Are you familiar with them?
da to
Yes. I'm familiar with the brigade rules. That represents one set of rules that regulate the way in which various brigades are to operate.
And just to break into the topic today, I wonder if we could have in equal P408 at page 1 in the BCS and page 2 in the English. And the portion of, thank you very much indeed. Who made these rules, General Pandurević?
ovo pravilo
These rules are part of the professional military literature that's available, and professionals made these rules. These brigade rules, well, they concern infantry brigades, motorized mountain brigades, marines, light brigades. These rules were created by the infantry administration.
And who or what is that?
Generalštab
The general staff of the JNA was organized in such a way that it consisted of several administrations. Occasionally it would change the way it was organized, but as far as I can remember, each arm of the army had its own administration that was responsible for it in terms of technique and doctrine, and thus the infantry administration was responsible for matters relating to the infantry.
Thank you. I wonder now if we can go down to, as it were, the legal force, if any, of these rules. We can see that they are made pursuant to item 34C of the instructions on the preparation and use of professional military literature. what are the instructions on the preparation and use of professional military literature?
Ja se ne bih sada
I wouldn't now like to comment on the content of these instructions because it's not fresh in my mind, but these are instructions that state how and who should issue professional military textbooks that would be used in military academies, military schools.
What is an instruction, as you understand it?
uputstvo.
Well, the word instruction says speaks for itself. It says that one instructs someone to do something, or it tells someone how to do something.
Thank you. Can we now look at P694, please? Page 12 in the BCS and page 3 in the English. And this is a different version of the same document. It's just that in this version, the pages we have been looking at are mistranslated, so we prefer the accurate translation of those first two pages.
Vidjeli ste na naslov.
You saw on the title page that these brigade rules concern 5 or 6 types of brigades, but there's one set of rules. That's why in this introductory part it says that given the differences in terms of organization and establishment, and given the purposes of various groups within the infantry, the provisions of these rules must be applied in a creative way, and so on and so forth. I have to point out that the brigades of the VRS were even more different in terms of organization and establishment and in terms of their purpose, even more different than these 5 or 6 brigades that these rules refer to, and that is why it was essential to have a creative approach to the application of these rules. With your permission, in legal terms I'm a layman, but I know there's such a thing as criminal law, and I know that there are textbooks on criminal law, but punishment is meted out on the basis of the law, not on the basis of these textbooks. And so this textbook functions in a similar manner, like a textbook on criminal law.
Well, I think we'll leave that there. There are just 2 or 3 things I want to deal with before we finish. At page 41, line 4 of the transcript, it's recorded that you described Dragan Petković is the former commander of the Zvornik Brigade. We can give you the text of the answer if you like. But did you describe him as the former commander or the formal commander?
Sve do
Up until a written order was drafted on my appointment, and up until the report on the transfer of duties, Petković was officially the commander of the Zvornik Brigade. That was his status there. But he didn't have any actual control over the brigade. I was the person who had such control.
Thank you. At page 32, line 24, it's recorded that you said in Visegrad you went to the hydroelectric plant with your forces. The Muslim forces left the plant and withdrew to Gorazda. Is that what you said, the Muslim forces, or something else?
Musliman
The Muslim forces were holding the hydroelectric power plant, and they had opened up a gap, and a lot of water got through the gap and flooded a Muslim village. The person who opened up that gap, well, his house was destroyed by the water. The people in Bosnia are familiar with this affair. The name of the man involved is Murad Shabanović.
Well, very well. Thank you very much, General Pandurević. We'll resume again tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Mr. Haynes. Thank you, Mr. Pandurević. As has just been stated, we'll resume tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you.
All rise. Would you believe it?